Good day to you and welcome to Life Mastery TV. We're going to have a lot of fun here today because we're going to be talking about something that I think is probably one of the most important things that we need to know in our world. My name is David McLeod. I am your Life Mastery coach, and that topic is communication. Now, communication is a vital ingredient for every relationship, whether it's your primary relationship or a relationship with your parent or with your child or a relationship with a friend or a relationship with a coworker. It doesn't really matter. Communication is the important thing. Now, unfortunately, what I have experienced, and maybe you have too, is that many forms of communication seem to be very charged or competitive or even mean-spirited. And that really doesn't make things very pleasant. In fact, that can lead to broken relationships and lots of other problems that I'm sure you can see in the world. In fact, the whole world is full of suffering that may be resulting specifically from bad communication. So today, we're going to talk about ways that we can make communication a more enjoyable process. We're going to learn some techniques for bringing ourselves more fully into our communication and become more empowered in the process. And to help me do that today, I have invited a very special guest, as you can see right here in my studio. This is my friend and colleague, Jillian Landis. Now, Jillian is a coach who works specifically in the area of mediation and relationship, and actually communication is a big part of her training as well. And so she's absolutely the right person to be here today. And I'm just so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm excited.
Thank you, David. I'm really excited to be here.
Good. So tell me, how did you find out, what was it about communication that kind of got you all excited and started thinking about things like mediation and stuff?
That's been a really long journey for me. So I had my own communication struggles. I've had a long history of codependency, learning how to set boundaries, learning how to be honest in my communication. And so I think that many times our own struggles become what we're most passionate about.
Very true. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then I worked in social work for a long time. And so I got to see a lot of communication struggles in other people, got to see how other people would tick or have, some of their own hang-ups and got to observe a lot and see what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about, having your own struggles, I mean, I've been there, and I'm sure most of the people watching this have been there too.
We all got to communicate.
That's right. And we all have struggles. And I think the biggest kind of struggle that I have found is sometimes I've got something going on inside that is a problem for me, and I don't necessarily know how to communicate what it is that's happening for me. Maybe I haven't, as a child, I certainly don't know necessarily how to say the right words to talk about what's going on. And parents don't often necessarily know how to teach their children these skills. So we've got a two-edged sword kind of problem here.
For sure.
And so I know for me, and this is probably true for you too, I had to learn those skills on my own after becoming an adult. And by that time, I had already created a lot of damage along the way, I hate to say, and I had hurt people because of my poor communication skills.
Yeah.
And so did you have a similar kind of experience happen in your life?
Absolutely. I have lots of wreckage. Lots of wreckage behind me from communication that was not loving. Because of, like what you were just pointing to is my own lack of clarity of what I wanted and needed, and my expectations of other people to just know what I was thinking and what I wanted without me expressing those things. Yeah.
That's right. Isn't that amazing how we kind of expect other people to read our minds?
Yes.
Yeah. I certainly had some of that going on in many of my relationships. As a matter of fact, I think when I was very young, I learned, my mother told me, she said, I know you better than you know yourself. And what that created in me was a belief that, I have to look out to everybody else to tell me who I am.
Yeah.
And therefore, I actually fell into that belief. Well, you should know who I am, what my problems are, what my needs are, what my wants are. I shouldn't have to tell you. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah. And, I learned I was really uncomfortable with communicating my truth, with setting boundaries. And so I really wanted people to just know anyway.
Right. Yeah.
And so I would place that expectation on other people that you should just know what I want. Everybody knows this is respectful. Everybody knows this is,
Right.
So I had kind of this very black and white view of what was good and right and healthy, and it's just not the same for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So I've learned today I must be really specific in what my requests are. Instead of saying I want respect, that might mean something very different to you than it means to me.
Right.
So maybe I would say I would appreciate if you would give me feedback in this way that feels more respectful to me. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. See, you're already moving into the idea of taking full ownership. Yes. For your own communication. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But there's something else you just said a moment ago that kind of got my attention. And now the way I interpret it is this. I may want to tell you something about what's going on for me, but there's a part of me that is afraid that if I tell you this, then you're going to have some kind of judgment about me that makes it so that we can't be friends anymore. So that's one of those weird psychological shadows that we all seem to have that makes it difficult to communicate.
Absolutely.
And so we withhold our truth and not necessarily expecting other people to figure it out for themselves, but we withhold it because we think we're doing them a favor. We're keeping them, we're preventing ourselves from hurting them. We're preventing ourselves from creating a bad dynamic. And what we end up creating in the long run is this bad dynamic that we were trying to avoid, because then the people we're with say we don't communicate.
Right. No, it's a safety mechanism. It's a coping skill.
Yeah.
So if I am withholding my truth because I'm afraid I'm going to be rejected or that it's not going to be accepted, my truth isn't going to be accepted, I'm not going to be accepted, then yeah. But the thing is, that's not honoring to me to hold that back. And ultimately it's not honoring to you for me to hold that back. And yes, the reality is, there's a risk of not being accepted. There's a risk of losing a relationship. Mm-hmm. And what I've learned is that that's okay. It's better to have honorable communication and honest communication, even if that could potentially lead to sometimes people aren't healthy enough to receive that. Yeah. Sometimes boundaries really piss people off. Yeah. A lot of the time they really piss people off.
Absolutely.
So I've learned to really get comfortable with the idea that I might lose this person, and that's okay, because honoring the other person in my communication is the highest form of love that I could ever offer. Yeah,
that's a beautiful statement. The highest form of love. I like that. And it really boils down to two key words you use there, and that's honest, open, from the heart kind of communication.
Yes.
Honest and open. And that's really what we're here to talk about, isn't it? Because what I found in my experience in communication with people, sometimes when I'm having a conversation, it seems like we're kind of in competition. We're in competition for the speaking space.
Uh-huh.
And many people will have this kind of dynamic where, you're listening to me right now, or I'm listening to you, as the case may be. And one or both of us is simply saying, okay, where's my chance to get in? Yeah. I'm looking for my opportunity to dive in and say something. And then once I switch, once the other person takes over, it then becomes more of a, well, I don't agree with what you said about this because of X, Y, and Z. It becomes this big, we become polar opposites.
Yeah.
And we're fighting each other instead of having a conversation.
Yes.
That's kind of a sad situation.
It is. It is.
Yeah. So how do you deal with that? I mean, as a mediator, you're probably running into this kind of problem all the time.
Yes. I certainly see people's competition. Often I think that happens because there's been such a long period of not being heard. And so really being able to acknowledge, again, going back to that self-clarifying, what are my needs and where do I need to be heard? And so to be able to break down conversations a little bit, I think sometimes we take on way too much information at one time. So if I'm trying to solve 5 different problems that are really hefty, big things, that's probably not going to go very well, and we are going to be vying for time and attention. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But if we can break that down and really be more intentional about what we're talking about, that's really key. And then it's really important for both people to be able to check themselves. Am I really hearing this other person? There's two
Right.
people with needs here.
Yep.
And so to be able to acknowledge both my needs
Mm-hmm.
and your needs,
Yeah.
and that they're both valid and they're both important, and we both have plenty of time. There's no lack of time or attention.
That's right. Yeah. That's a very important perspective, I think. The other part of competitive competition competitive communication that I've noticed, competitions are competitive.
Yes.
What I've noticed is that sometimes it's the way the words are spoken. Mm-hmm. I've noticed a lot of people use language that starts off, first of all, they use you statements a lot.
Yes.
They don't own what they're speaking for themselves. They don't say, this is my experience, this is how I'm showing up or whatever. They talk about, as an example, going fishing. Uh-huh. When you go fishing and you toss that thing out there and you roll it. Well, I understand how people communicate that way. It's basically projecting my own stuff out there onto you.
Yeah.
Rather than simply saying, I went fishing, and one of the experiences I had was as I was throwing this thing out there and I started reeling it back in, I caught a fish and this happened. When I speak in that different way, it makes it much easier for you to hear me.
Yes.
Because I'm not saying you statements and you're trying to figure out, is he talking about me or is he talking about himself? So by taking on personal ownership and speaking from the I, the first person,
yes.
It becomes, I'm speaking only about myself and I'm not speaking anything about you. And this means taking ownership of any judgments that I have, any interpretations that I'm making, any thoughts that I might have, rather than simply projecting them out there and stating them as if they were fact.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that I statements are super helpful. You statements are pretty much just eliciting an attack.
Yeah, that's right.
It really just engages that.
Back in, I apologize for the problem there, friends. It says I've left the room, but I'm here now. I think you can see that. So I can't remember where we were when that happened.
We were talking about I statements.
Yes. Yep. Okay.
Yep.
So you were saying something about I statements. If you can reconnect to your starting point, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. So you statements, a lot of us will use, you should have, you need to, you did this. So, it can be very blaming and it definitely elicits an attack.
Right.
So when I'm able to work with clients on reframing that to I statements, this is going to work for me, or this isn't going to work for me, or this is what I'm going to do. Yeah. There's much less to argue about.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. That's a perfectly good point. When you say, I don't like you.
Yeah.
I say, oh, I understand you don't like me. It's just a fact about yourself.
Right.
But when you say something like, you're an asshole or you're an idiot, now I get defensive and I respond to that.
Yes.
It's a very different kind of response. So it's really important, I think, to make sure we come from the I statement place.
Yes.
And I want to point out something. You mentioned sometimes you'll hear people say, you should do this or you need to do this, you need to fix me somehow or whatever. Well, people may think by going to I statements that they can simply rephrase that as, I think you should.
Yes.
That's still a pointing statement,
Definitely.
A blaming statement. And what you really mean when you say, I think you should, you're actually hiding from something like, I get uncomfortable when such and such, when I see you do such and such. This is what happens for me. I get fearful. I tie back to some event that happened when I was a little boy that my mother abandoned me or something like that. Wow, that's deep.
Yeah.
All of a sudden now I'm taking it and I'm saying, I understand now what's going on for me. And I know it's not your fault. I'm just saying that when that happened, this is how I reacted.
Yeah.
And you can say, wow, thank you for sharing that.
Right.
It's a whole different dynamic. that comes about.
Very different. And I think it's also important, blame comes into communication a lot. And it's very toxic and it really destroys a lot of relationships. So those you statements often are just a form of blaming.
Right.
They're making somebody else responsible for my feelings.
Exactly.
My reactions. And then, even making someone else responsible for my healing.
Right.
If I say, when you do such and such, then I'm in this place of, trauma or whatever. Well, I can make someone aware of that, but I also get to take ownership of, I'm working on healing that, right? Nobody is responsible for tiptoeing around me and my problems and my past.
This is great. Saying something like, you made me feel.
Yes. Yeah.
You made me feel like I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
How many times have you heard that in a relationship? How many times have I said it?
Yeah.
And I realize it's completely wrong. It is 100% wrong. It isn't true. It can't possibly be true because you don't have the power to make me feel anything.
Right.
You simply have the power to do what you do, and I have the responsibility for how I choose to react to that.
So yes, and.
Okay, great. I like this.
So I'm going to segue a little bit into a little different area of communication. So for me, my truth has been, for a long time, I had that perspective, still hold that perspective that you can't make me feel anything. I'm responsible for my feelings.
Right.
And today I choose not to keep myself in situations where I'm being spoken to in a way that's just disrespectful or dishonorable.
Right.
And that was a confusing thing for me for a while because I thought that, well, I'm responsible for my feelings. So I just get to, protect myself or not react or whatever the healthy thing was in the middle of a toxic relationship. Whereas today I realize that what's most honoring for me is to let those conversations go, maybe even let that person go, but not to just put all of that responsibility on myself to just make it be okay.
Sure. I totally get that. And I agree with that too, by the way. Sometimes you set your own boundaries.
Yes.
Excuse me. You make your own choices and you decide, this is how far I'm willing to let you go.
Yeah.
You go beyond that, then I'm going to leave the relationship.
Yes.
And we all have to make those choices at some point.
Yep.
Now, we have to also be careful that while I want to set boundaries, I need to make you aware of my boundaries too.
Absolutely, yes.
If you're not aware of my boundaries, then that's my fault. That's my bad. Mm-hmm. And the other part of boundaries is sometimes if I don't know what your boundaries are, I may cross the boundaries in order to find out what they are.
Yeah.
Because once I've gone far enough, you'll be quiet and quiet and quiet and quiet until I reach a certain point, and then you say, whoa, far enough. Mm-hmm. Now I know where your boundary is. Mm-hmm. And then I might be able to engage the conversation. That was great. Can you now help me understand more about your boundaries?
Yes. Boundaries are really tricky to me because I've learned that they're really a process of discovery, both for myself and the other person.
Yeah.
So I often discover boundaries in myself, like, oh, I don't really like that. But I didn't know that. Maybe 5 minutes ago, I didn't know that. But I know that now.
And 5 minutes from now, you might like it again.
I could change.
Because that's the beauty of boundaries. They're like shifting sands.
They are, and they all hinge on knowing myself.
Right.
So I hear complaints a lot about, well, they didn't respect my boundary. What do I do now? Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting because so much of this starts with how do I know and understand my boundaries? Do I know and understand what's really important and valuable to me? And then do I honor that and respect that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do I honor and respect my own boundaries?
Yes.
And do I allow space for my boundaries to change?
Yeah.
Important questions. And I think that we, as part of our communication process, need to be able to recognize that those boundaries can move. Yep. And right now, this is my boundary. Right now, I don't want to do X. Or right now, I'm not able to get involved in Y, or whatever the case may be. So yes, that part is a very important piece of communication. Mm-hmm. And in a healthy relationship, the person who is expressing the boundary will be heard by a person who respects the boundary. That's kind of how it works.
Yes.
But in an unhealthy relationship, or maybe in a relationship where there's an imbalance of power and one person is abusing that power, those boundaries will not be honored, or they may not be honored.
Right. Yeah. What I've found in really healthy relationships are that my yeses and nos are both respected.
Of course.
It's safe.
Yep.
It's safe and trusting to be able to say no, even if it's disappointing to the other person. It can be.
Yeah.
I can get disappointed by someone else's no or their boundary, but it's accepted. It's not going to be, nobody's going to try to usurp that or manipulate that into a different outcome.
Right. The other thing about yeses and nos, by the way, I have found that in my life, I would often say yes when no was my truth.
Yes. I'm so glad you're bringing this up.
And the problem was I was saying yes because I thought that's what would create a deeper connection with people. I thought that's what I needed to do in order to be able to have intimate relationships with people. And I don't necessarily mean sexual. I just mean intimate, connected relationships. And what I discovered was those relationships weren't as deep as I wanted them to be. It wasn't until I discovered the power of no that my relationships start to get deeper, because then people who understood when I said no were much more trusting of my yes when it came.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they know it's honest.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I've learned about myself is I'm a recovering people pleaser. Is that okay with you?
No. I was a people pleaser too, so I can relate. Is that okay with you?
So I've learned to constantly, or had learned to constantly check in with other people and what they're feeling, and then like I would make my feelings whatever they're feeling, and I still get to work on this. I still get to be aware. But yeah, constantly checking in and saying, how do I feel about this? Is this a yes for me? Is this a no? And it takes tremendous courage to honor that and to be honest in yeses and nos. And that's a constant work of art for me. And I think all of us, sometimes we're great and, step right on being courageously honest. And then other times like, I got to go back and remedy that and make amends because I wasn't honest.
Right.
Yep.
I love it. This is great conversation. And I'm feeling very connected to you now, because I believe what's happening is, we're revealing ourselves while still hearing each other.
Yeah. So
we're kind of modeling this idea of empowered communication just by our conversation.
Sure.
So we talked a little bit about authentically owning our own truth.
Yeah.
And, really there's two sides to a conversation. There's the speaking side, and then there's the listening side. And I'm sure we've all heard the old joke, you've got 2 ears, so you're supposed to listen twice as much as you talk. 2 ears and 1 mouth. And I'm thinking about that, and I thought if everybody listened twice as much as they talked, there wouldn't be any talking at all.
This is true.
Because there wouldn't be time. Of course, it's a ridiculous statement. The only reason we have 2 ears is to help us pick up the location of sound. That's all. We don't need 2 mouths.
Thank God.
That's right. But anyway, so we have the two different aspects of communication. And I think we've been talking a lot about the speaking. When I'm going to share something with you, I need to do it from an honest, open-hearted space where I am owning everything and not putting anything onto you. And if I do have judgments about you, then it's only fair for me to own those as judgments. I can say, I notice I've got this judgment that, or this thought, or this belief, or this story that such and such. So, for example, here's one example that I hear people say, I'm feeling neglected. Well, neglected isn't a feeling, I hate to say it. Neglected is a judgment. And what you really mean to say when you say that is, I'm actually feeling sad. And the thought that I have around that sadness is I'm associating it with a sense of neglect. Like I have this judgment that you're not paying attention to me, not paying enough attention to me. And I want to be connected to you.
Mm-hmm.
So now in that whole process, what I was showing was an example of how I go underneath the neglected to find out the true feeling,
yes.
which is sadness and disconnection and a desire for connection.
Yeah.
That's what it is. And, I know you're not neglecting me, but that's the judgment I'm putting on you because of how I'm feeling. And it's triggering some old stuff from years ago.
Yeah. I love that. It really reminds me of, are you familiar with Marshall Rosenberg's work?
Yeah.
Nonviolent communication.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so same idea. It was amazing when I read that book. It was so interesting because as a social worker, I learned I feel statements really early on. Been doing these for years, right? And then I read this book and I'm like, shit, I've been doing this all wrong.
Exactly.
So I was constantly saying, I feel disrespected or whatever not feelings. So that was really interesting to learn to rephrase both feelings and needs. So I'm feeling disappointed, frustrated, sad, happy, whatever, because I have a need for, and then exploring what that need is. So like neglect, well, I have a need for attention or connection. So really getting curious, and so much of life, I think, is about just getting curious, right?
Yeah.
These painful moments happen, whether it's in communication or in the body or whatever the pain is, it's pointing us to self-love and curiosity.
Right.
And so, communication and coming up against these feelings, it's no different. I'm just here to learn about myself and learn how to love and honor myself and others better.
This is a funny thing. I have a name for this. I call it past participle projection or something. I can't remember the other word, but the idea is if you say I feel followed by any word that ends in ED, you are actually describing a thought or a story or a judgment or an interpretation.
Yeah.
And the true feeling is underneath that.
Yes, agreed.
And I learned this years ago when I was taking a program called Clean Talk. And it's very, very powerful. So you mentioned, I'm glad you brought this up about the whole I feel thing, because not only do we misuse I feel as not really feelings at all, but we also use it to pretend that our thoughts are feelings.
Yeah.
So for example, I feel like.
Yep.
Or
followed by like. It's not.
I feel that.
Yeah.
Or I feel as if.
Yep.
And whenever I say something like that, and I know I still do it. I mean, I don't always. I mean, in this moment, I'm trying to be very conscious of what I say.
Gosh, you're human.
But when I'm in just regular everyday activities, sometimes I'll say stuff like that. And then I have to catch myself and say, oh, I see I just used a thought and tried to pretend it was a feeling.
Yeah.
And I think this is a big problem in our society because I hear kids doing it all the time. I hear adults doing it all the time. I feel like. Well, sorry, lady, sir, ma'am, kid, whatever. That's not a feeling.
Yeah.
It's a thought. So I think what we need to do is say, okay, well, instead of I feel like, I say I think, or I believe, or I have this story. What changes about your communication? And most of the stuff that we talk about really is coming from our ego mind anyway. And so what if we could pause and instead of even saying, I have a story, or I
love that.
I'm making up something about you. What if I said, I am hallucinating that you are neglecting me?
Yes.
Because that's really what it is. It's a hallucination in my mind, and my ego mind is making up the story because it's afraid of something that happened years and years and years ago.
So true. I love the storyline. That was huge for me when I was reading Brene Brown's literature. I absolutely love her, one of her biggest fans. And she talks about, exactly that. We fill in all the blanks, right? If I have a lack of information, I will fill in all the blanks with my own story.
That's right.
And then I've made some sort of crazy judgment about what's going on between you and me. And so if I can just come and say, hey, David, I've got the story in my head that, when I came in today, you made this sigh and I really felt like you weren't excited to see me or whatever, this is the stuff we do.
Yeah.
And so then that gives you the opportunity to say, gosh, no, I was just upset that the dog peed on the ground or whatever,
That's right. Yeah.
So, giving someone else the opportunity to clear up our story and to acknowledge that this is a story. That's huge. To acknowledge this is not truth. This is a story. I get to see and discover if it is truth, but this is a story.
Right. I've done a lot of personal growth work, and one of the organizations that I've gone to participate in their programs is called the Human Awareness Institute.
Uh-huh.
And they have a whole bunch of wonderful, wonderful workshops that are all related to love, intimacy, and sexuality, and really about communication with one another and being in relationship. Mm-hmm. And they have a couple of processes that I really like. One is called the withhold. Mm-hmm. And the idea is I'm sitting here with some small, maybe I got a little bit of a charge with you about something. Maybe I saw you do something and it's just bugging me. And I don't want to say anything because the reason I don't want to say something is because it's such a small, tiny little itty bitty thing. It's not going to amount to much. Mm-hmm. The problem is if I withhold that and then later on something else happens and you do something else, and that's a second withhold that I don't want to tell you about. Well, what I'm basically doing is I'm putting little bricks on the ground between us. And before you know it, these bricks are getting taller and taller, and I'm creating a wall.
Yes.
So they talk about what happens is one day you'll throw your socks on the floor, and that'll be it. I'll just explode. Uh-huh. And you'll be sitting there saying, where is this coming from? Uh-huh. This is what happens in our relationships. We withhold. Yeah. So what they teach in high is actually when you have that moment, you notice that little tiny twinge. Yep. That's the time.
Absolutely.
To go to your partner and say, look, I have a withhold that I'd like to share with you. Are you willing to hear it?
Mm-hmm. So this is interesting because I think that that's so true, but I also think a lot of relationships they don't have the capacity for that.
Yeah.
And we intuitively know this because we know we're not safe to say X, Y, Z.
Right.
And so what was challenging for me was to get really honest with myself about the bandwidth I was allowing out, all of the energy I was allowing to be zapped out of me.
Right.
Because I wasn't able to have these honorable conversations. And so becoming a lot more conscious and uncompromising about the types of communication I was willing to allow in my space. I want to feel safe to set those kind of boundaries. I want to feel safe to say, dude, it really bothers me when you leave your socks on the floor.
Yeah.
Right. And that's not going to be a personal big thing.
Right. Right. And you're absolutely right about, people not necessarily being at the level where they can have that kind of relationship where mm-hmm. I just approach you and say, I've got this withhold. Are you willing to hear it? Mm-hmm. Now, the beauty of by giving you permission to say no, mm-hmm. I'm actually respecting your space. Mm-hmm. And when you do say no, then I might ask, well, is there a time later that we can talk about this? Mm-hmm. Or you can volunteer that. I'm not really available right now. I've got something going on, but I would love to talk to you. How about we do it, later on this afternoon? Mm-hmm. Just having that kind of relationship can just it just takes it through the roof.
Absolutely, yes.
And then, of course, we still have to remember that when I do share the withhold, it's not about me trying to make you wrong. No. It's not about me trying to beat you up. It's not about me trying to say anything bad about you whatsoever. Mm-hmm. It's simply about me telling you about this little twinge that happened when such and such took place. Yep. And then maybe you can help me process it and find out, well, where's that really from?
Yeah.
That's the beauty of the withhold.
And I think when we set boundaries, because that's kind of the same dynamic as when I tell you what's important to me or not, or what's bothering me, I'm also fully accepting of what that person's answer is.
Right.
They might say, well, Jill, you can screw off. I like throwing my socks on the floor. That's important to me. Yeah. That could be an answer.
Right. That's true.
And so then I get to then examine how important that is to me.
Right. Is this a battle you want to fight?
Yeah. So I think, communication is very important completely accepting of whatever my feelings and emotions are. I get to communicate those honestly.
Mm-hmm.
And I also get to accept whatever your feelings and emotions and needs are as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason I even brought that up about the whole withhold is because you were talking about the story.
Yeah.
And one other aspect of this same teaching from Human Awareness Institute is, instead of approaching you with, I have a withhold, I can approach you with, oh God, now the word just popped out of my head. Oh God, I am feeling, what is the word? Well, I've lost the word, so I guess we're just going to have to leave that in the space of mystery until it comes back. Okay. Yeah. Just because you believe you're such and such doesn't mean people aren't following you. What's the word?
Doesn't mean people aren't following me.
Paranoid. That's it.
Ah, okay.
Oh God. I have a paranoia.
Ah.
That is the way it phrases. And the paranoia, you can say, oh, really? What's your paranoia? My paranoia is, and now I tell you the story. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's, once again, you get the opportunity to share, well, that's not what I intended, and I'm sorry that triggered that response for you. Mm-hmm. Would you like to have a further discussion about this?
Right.
Whatever.
Yeah.
So all of this is really powerful stuff in helping to create space for communication. Mm-hmm. But we haven't really talked at all about the listening side.
Okay.
And I'd like to just go through this a little bit, because in my experience, I think there's 5 levels of learning, okay. 5 levels of listening. And the first level, I call it level 0, because there's no listening going on at all. I'm basically ignoring you. Okay. And we've all experienced that too. You're trying to get my attention, you're trying to communicate, and
I might as well be a wall.
I'm on my phone or something, and I'm pretending to listen or whatever. Mm-hmm. The second level is what I call competitive listening, mm-hmm. where now all I'm really doing, this is level 1, by the way, every time you say something, I'm trying to jump in with my response. Mm-hmm. And you know what that's like, mm-hmm. Oh, you had that. Oh, I've had that happen too. Or, oh, you should go and see a doctor because of such and such. I'm doing all these things to interrupt your train of thought and trying to problem solve and diagnose and all these other things. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like a competitive listening. Mm-hmm. Well, then level 2 comes along, and we're starting to actually get into listening now. And this is, I call passive listening, where I'm basically just hearing you. I'm not necessarily giving you any feedback. I'm not necessarily active listening. I haven't got to that stage yet. Yeah. But I am hearing you. Mm-hmm. And you may, as each of these levels changes, when you're the one speaking, you may feel a sense of deeper and deeper connection as we improve these levels of listening. Yeah. At level 3, now I start to engage with you more. Okay. At level 2, I may find myself still relating what you say to my own experience, but not necessarily talking about that. Mm-hmm. At level 3 now, I'm completely separate from my own story, my own issues. I'm hearing you 100%, and I'm empathizing with everything that you're saying. And at the same time, I'm maybe paying more attention to body language, things that you're not saying, mm-hmm. but which you are communicating to me. Mm-hmm. And I might, at this point, also start deepening by asking questions like, well, tell me more. How was that for you? Mm-hmm. What was the thing that you were trying to accomplish? And I avoid questions that have why in them, because that kind of leads you into I have to justify this now. Why is a kind of a judgmental question. Mm. So that's at level 3. And then what I think is one of the best levels of communication at all is what I call collaborative listening. Mm-hmm. Where not only are you and I communicating with each other, but we're facilitating deeper listening for both of us and for anybody else who happens to be present. Mm-hmm. So we're facilitating level 3 listening across the room. Those are the levels that I'm familiar with. Mm-hmm. And when I'm in a relationship with somebody who is at a level 3 or 2 at the lowest, that is when the relationship really feels good for me. Mm-hmm.
So I think, did you go over 4?
4 is the collaborative level. So I start at 0. 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Gotcha. Okay.
There's 5 levels.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, I was like, wait a second, I think we missed one.
Well, that's because I start at 0 because there's no listening going on. That's all.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
Yeah.
I think absolutely collaborative listening. I don't think I've heard that before. That's great. I definitely am familiar with active listening.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think questions and curiosity are super important.
Right.
I love the questions. Can you tell me more about that? Or can you clarify what you mean by this word? Because I think a lot does get missed in communication where, like earlier when I said, you may have a different meaning for respect than I do.
Absolutely.
I want to know that. Well, what does that mean to you?
Yeah.
And then I can really get a clearer picture.
Yep.
And so that's super important, I think, in communication, is just knowing each other.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's right. And, you brought up another very, very good point. I mean, so many wonderful points here. And that is the point of language.
Uh-huh.
Most of us in this country anyway speak English.
Mm-hmm.
And that, for most of us, it's the primary language. But every word in English has a meaning. There's this collective meaning out here that we all kind of agree on. Mm-hmm. But then each of us individually have our own little variations on those words. Mm-hmm. Now, some words are pretty straightforward, like a color red, for example. Yeah. Almost everybody knows what that means. Yeah. But there's other words like travel. Well, what does that mean? Travel, might mean getting out of the bed, get in the car, go to the store, get some food, and come back home. Mm-hmm. Or it might mean something as grand as taking a journey to Mars.
Sure.
Travel means a variety of different things to different people.
True.
So every word has its own variations. And so when I say something to you, and you may understand exactly what I'm saying, but as you already pointed out, you may need to clarify.
Yes.
And so that's a powerful part of active listening.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think we can easily misunderstand each other.
Mm-hmm. So what can we do to improve our understanding of each other?
Clarifying.
What else?
I do think listening is really important. Repeating, that's part of active listening. Mm-hmm. So it's not only, I'm paying attention to body language, to eye contact, to facial emotions. I'm listening to tone of voice, maybe frustration that could be happening. Frustration is a great indicator that we're missing something. Mm-hmm. I'm not hearing you correctly. You're wanting me to hear something different. So paying attention to all those cues are important. Repeating back is huge. Yeah. I'm hearing that, mm-hmm. and then repeating back.
Right, and what I've learned sometimes in feeding back like that, choosing slightly different words to say, this is what I'm hearing from you. Yes. Is this what you meant? Mm-hmm. That's how I'm understanding it. And that way we can eliminate any of the confusion that might be happening.
Yes.
And the other thing I found helpful in that regard is if someone says to me, well, this is what I heard, is that what you meant? I can say, no, here's what I actually meant. Yes. Mm-hmm. So I can clarify for myself as well as for you.
Well, and that's a good point, that in communication, I think a lot of the time we are also clarifying mm-hmm. my own thoughts and feelings and needs. I may not be 100% clear. So sometimes someone will ask me, well, can you clarify what you mean by that word, or what you mean by this? And I then get to go, oh boy, let me figure that out, because I may not know.
Right.
So then I get to be even more clear, and I get to honor my needs and feelings even more.
It makes for a wonderful connective journey, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. When that kind of communication actually works, you get to see the other person for the amazing being he or she is. Mm-hmm. And in that, and you also at the same time get to see yourself.
Yes.
See, I'm using you statements there. Do you notice how I did that?
You are.
I'm using you statements. Let me rephrase that.
Good catch.
Yeah. It's kind of, when I get into the teaching mode, sometimes I do that.
Yeah.
And so, So the other piece that I wanted to talk about is this whole thing about open-heartedness. Trying to, instead of coming from the ego, from the ego mind, from the logical brain, trying to come from the heart and communicating from that soul space. I find that when I do that, I deepen the communication for myself, and I improve the possibility of deeper connection with the other person.
Yeah, what that really taps on for me is vulnerability. Being willing to show up and be seen, even if there's some risk involved. Right. That's open-heartedness to me.
Right. Yeah, and I know that people kind of recoil at the word vulnerable because there's this. Maybe it's only in Western culture, I don't know, but it seems to be in our world. If you are vulnerable, you're basically you're dead meat. If you allow yourself to be completely open and seen, then you're just opening yourself up for total demolishment and destruction. That's how people think about it. And the truth is, and I certainly thought about that a lot too, but until I started doing some very deep work and I got into group processes where vulnerability was the only way to heal. Yes. And what I discovered in the process was that opening up and becoming vulnerable in the right space, of course, I'm not saying we should do this everywhere. Sure. But by opening up and becoming vulnerable and revealing, that deep, moist, loving heart that I have, even with all the foibles and the darkness that I had wrapped around it, people actually started connecting with me more, not less. And they didn't attack my weakness as I thought they would. Instead, what they did was they resonated for themselves with my weakness, or with what I thought of as weakness.
Yes. Yeah, vulnerability, it's interesting because it's very connecting. And I like one of Brene Brown's quotes is, vulnerability is the first thing that we look for in other people and the last thing we want to show in ourselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
And I find that to be very true. The stuff that's stuck in the closet for me, right, that I really, really, really don't want to share, that's painful and embarrassing and whatever. That's the stuff that really connects me to other people. And when I share that stuff, people are then able to be in a safe enough space to say, I'm so glad somebody else feels that way too. Right. And it's amazing. So vulnerability, even though a lot of people have viewed it as weakness, I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage to be vulnerable. Yeah. It's brave to be vulnerable.
It is. That's right. It's total courage. And isn't it interesting? The word courage actually comes from the word cœur, which means heart. And I find it interesting. So courage and heart naturally go together. Yeah. And so what we're talking about is being open-hearted. Now that doesn't mean you simply open yourself up to be attacked. You don't do this in situations that are already known to be unsafe. But at the same time, you want to keep coming from love as much as possible. Yeah. Even in the darkest places that you go.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a difference between oversharing and vulnerability. A big distinction for me is if I'm in the middle of something that I'm not healed from, then I want to share that in a really safe space with someone who is a healer, somebody who I'm working with to heal that particular thing. Right. When I have gone through the process of healing, that's now part of my story and part of my empowerment, and now something that can be used to help and heal other people.
Yeah. Awesome. What a great way to we've got some comments here. I see Beverly says, if I'm vulnerable, I can understand myself better to set boundaries when I am not feeling safe. Wow, that's a beautiful statement. Yeah. Thank you, Beverly, for sharing that. I appreciate it. Yeah. We've had an amazing conversation here. Yes, and it's already, we have with that little glitch in the middle, which I'll fixed later. But anyway, yeah, it's been awesome having this time with you and really discussing what I think is a very, very important topic for people to grok, if you like, for want of a better word. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this tremendously.
Yeah. And thank you all for being here as well. I'm just so delighted that you came and joined us today, and I hope you got some value out of today's presentation. Please remember you can watch the recordings for this and every other show that I do. It's on my Life Mastery TV website. That's life-mastery-tv.com. And remember, as you go through your week, take the Life Mastery mantra as something that you can recite for yourself and bring into your heart. It really does help, I think, to make your life better. It goes like this. I gratefully forgive the imperfect being I have been in the past. I gratefully accept the magnificent being that I am right now. And I gratefully welcome the evolved being I am becoming in each new moment. So, thank you again. Until we meet again, my name is David McLeod, your Life Mastery Coach, and I'm wishing you love, light, and blessings on your continuing journey. Bye for now.